Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 93rd episode of our COVID-19 series for health professionals and by health professionals. And those of you who are habitués of this series will know that once a month we do a panel show in which we try and catch up on some of the questions that we failed to answer in the last 4 weeks, or indeed 2 years, whichever is the easiest. Now then, recently the Observer described this series as a cult. And so like all good cults, we have new members and old members. And so it's a pleasure to welcome back today to two of our old members. First of all, Professor Calum Semple. Calum is Professor of Child Health and Outbreak Medicine at the University of Liverpool, and he's a consultant paediatrician at Alder Children's Hospital and a member of SAGE. On your, is it your tweet account or wiki or somewhere, you describe your hobbies, Campbell, as bagpiping and dog walking. One assumes if you play the bagpipe whilst walking a very big dog, you will be the only inhabitant of Liverpool who truly always walks alone. I thank you. Now then, and then we've got Professor Stephen Reicher, Professor of Social Psychology at the University of St Andrews, a member of both SAGE and Indie-SAGE. The only thing he has in common with Boris Johnson, therefore, he believes in having his cake and eating it. And he's the master of the 3-minute soundbite on the Today programme. But all cults must survive on their ability to recruit new members. And so we welcome for the first time Professor Polly Roy, Chair of Virology at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine for the past 20 years. I mean, that worked and trained in a series of the world's top places for doing virology. And she's indeed the world authority on something called Bluetongue Virus, which I must admit is not something I've heard of. But today, obviously, we'll be talking on coronavirus. So welcome all. And we kick off, as we always do, with a quick round of Desert Island Papers, in which I ask you all to talk about something that's caught your mind or caught your eyes in the last few days in the press, in the media, or anything and ever. So who wants to start? Calum, would you like to kick off as an old hand?
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be speaking to you again. And my Desert Island paper is the report of the FEAST study by Kath Maitland, and its title is Mortality After Fluid Boluses in African Children with Severe Infection. And it's the largest and only controlled trial that's ever been taken of fluid resuscitation. And I think everybody expected, well, fluid boluses are really good for children that need fluid resuscitation. It's what was absolutely standard practice. And you know what? We're all wrong. It turns out that in African children with severe febrile illness, there was actually an excess mortality, and it was the result of cardiovascular collapse. It was not fluid overload. It was not respiratory distress. These were children whose hearts were essentially stopping. And Kath then went on to do a trial looking at transfusion strategy, and another trial looking at oxygen thresholds for supplemental oxygen. She's really shaken the paradigms of traditional pediatric practice, where everybody thinks you must give loads of fluid, loads of oxygen, and loads of blood. And in nearly every situation, she's been shown to be right, and we've all been wrong. And it's having the confidence and sharpness of mind and intellect to tackle these really difficult challenges and pursue them into clinical trials. And I really take my hat off to Kath for doing that. And so that's my Desert Island paper, the FEAST study report.
Wow, that reminds me of the cerebral malaria trial when we were all students, which one trial completely changed. Remember, steroids and cerebral malaria, which everyone had done, turned out killed and didn't save. Wow, extraordinary. Okay, and Stephen, what have you got?
What have I got? Well, I'm sure I'm not going to be as good a stand-up comic as you, so I apologize for that in advance. I hadn't realized how many skills you had. I'm going to talk about a very old paper. It's over 50 years old, and it's a paper by a historian, very famous historian, E.P. Thompson, called The Moral Economy of the Crowd in the 18th Century. And the question is, what does that have to do with medicine, and what does that have to do with COVID? Well, there are, in effect, two very different psychologies of crisis. One is the psychology of panic, which assumes that people, especially in their masses, in their groups, behave irrationally and therefore they need to be managed and they need to be controlled by government because they can't look after themselves, and they need to be patronized by government because they can't think for themselves. And if you give them information, they're liable to panic even more. And the other, and I think it's the psychology which has gradually become more dominant over recent years, and Simon, you've been involved in it, is what you might call a psychology of collective resilience, one which recognizes that when people come together, and when they come together in groups and support each other, that gives them the support and it gives them the strength to deal with difficult times, that resilience isn't something in us, resilience is something that happens between us. Now, the psychology of panic is rooted in classic crowd psychology, which again assumes that in groups, in crowds, people lose their identity and become mindless. And when in the 1970s, I was doing my PhD on crowd behavior, and I read around it, and I read this classic crowd psychology. I also read in history the work of E.P. Thompson. And Thompson looks at food riots. In the UK, there were about 700 food riots between about 1780 and 1820. And you might think the food riot is the simplest example of collective irrationality. People get hungry, they lose control, they storm the granaries, and they take a food away to eat. And what Thompson very carefully shows us is, first of all, that these things don't happen simply when people are hungry. They happen when there is more food available, but when food is transported out of the area. And he also shows us they're not just explosions, they're highly patterned events, whereby people would take the food, they would distribute it at the popular price, they would give the money, sometimes even the grain sacks, back to the owners. And he argues that what's going on here is a clash between two moral economies. The classic moral economy of a feudal society where everything is local, and if food is available, it's sold locally, and the new morality of the market whereby you sell things at the highest price. And these two moralities clash at the moment that food is transported out of the area. And what people are doing is asserting their collective understanding, their collective meanings over and above that which is being imposed upon them. So he begins to show with the precision of a brilliant historian, he maps out the way in which collective behavior is not mindless, it's meaningful, and what is more, people are empowered through acting collectively. So for me, the work of E.P. Thompson fed into my own work on crowd psychology, which has fed, I think, to some extent, through work of many people I've worked with, John Drury being one of them, into a psychology of crisis, which I think is very pertinent indeed to this pandemic, because I think the great problem of this pandemic is that the government have not trusted the public. And so the slogan I would give you after that long introduction is trust the public and trust them when they come together collectively.
Brilliant, and wonderful to have EP making of the working class, as Thompson mentioned on the programme. It was 50 years ago, I did say in the last few weeks, but no, that's fine, that's absolutely fine. And Cliff Stock covered it very nicely when he was on as well, so we've had a bit on collective behaviour. Okay, so Polly, over to you.
Well, thank you, Simon. You said that I work with Bluetongue virus, and you don't know, but Bluetongue is an RNA virus. It's a double-stranded genome, RNA genome. That's the point. I've been interested in RNA viruses for a long time, and I work with HIV and SARS and flu and polio, many others before I started to work on double-stranded RNA virus, because genome that makes by RNA is very interesting. And COVID is very, very interesting to me also because it has a long genome, 30 kb RNA, positive strand we call. Now, studies that why certain SARS-CoV-2 variant virus have better fitness, mainly focused only on one protein of the virus, which is spike protein, we call, and this is the protein that actually bind to the human receptor. And this is the gateway of the virus into the human cells. So everybody focus on that to understand the emergence of the viruses. Just recently, a couple of weeks ago, a paper came out, which is my desert island paper really, is written by a group of people and researchers in Berkeley, in University of California. And what they have done, they're showing this spike protein has minor role plays in the virus emergence. Main role is played by another protein called nucleocapsid or N protein, and which actually impact bigger role on the virus emergence through this RNA packaging activity of the protein. So what is important in this paper to showing that one of the reasons that everybody focus on spike protein because it's the entry protein, and it's impossible to work with the whole virus, which is highly infectious, required what we call a high security lab, BCL3. Most people use the spike protein displaying in another safe virus, so such as lentivirus or something, and then they just look into the virus uptake, no other function. That doesn't tell you how virus replicate in the cells. So to avoid that situation, this group have shown they made a very different kind of assay system, which what to do, they make a virus mimic 4 structural protein, S protein and M protein, where the virus spike protein sits, nucleocapsid protein N and E protein together, they make a virus mimic called virus-like particle. And they also use a little bit of viral genome, not the whole genome that causes infection, but a little bit of that N protein recognizes. Using that, then they can understand everything, every stage of the virus life cycle almost. So because nucleocapsid does the virus, the genome release, which is important for replication, virus replication, as well as also uncoating the genome. All of these things depends on different protein, not S protein. So using that, they also made all the mutation of the S protein that people tested, all the variant viruses, alpha, beta, gamma, delta, all of this. And also all the mutations on the N protein that nobody tested yet. And what they found out that S protein has very little impact on emergence. It is the N protein that simultaneously mutating is responsible for doing all these different variants, existence, Delta virus, and transmissions and infectivity, high infectivity. So they actually developed two important issues on that. One, that N is very important for virus emergence. Second, that they can screen any new variant very quickly by this virus like particle, and what is important for that virus variant. So I find it's highly exciting, this, because it's opened up a new door for us to understand how this virus actually replicate and what stage is important for emerging of the virus. So is all of this spike protein people talking is not really important so much. So that's, I find it's very normal.
Good, and this is good news, Polly, I think, from the way you're smiling as you say this. This is good news for the future.
It's very good.
Right. It's very good. Now, as you're the newcomer, you seem to have attracted those questions already, and indeed some hangover questions. So let's start off a couple of things aimed at you then. I mean, last Christmas, looking back, we were talking about nothing but Delta, and now, you know, I'm told like Facebook or football, it's taken over the world, and 99.99% or whatever is the Delta variation. But it's not as simple as that, is it? Because we've now got a new variation of a variation of a variation of Delta. I can't remember what it is now, 4.2 or something. But one that is actually seems to be milder than the original Delta. Explain to me how this can happen.
Well, because remember I said I'm very interested in RNA viruses because RNA continuously changing. But coronaviruses, particularly SARS-CoV-2 also included, doesn't change much. They have a proofreading mechanism. Nevertheless, they will have 1 or 2 mutations here or there, okay? And if that makes the virus much more better fitness, because this N protein mutation that I talked about, a couple of them, they did about 15 different mutations and showing that the fitter. That means they have much better, higher titer of virus they're making than the original virus. And they're also assembly much better, protein is much better, because everything information is in the gene itself, and how, because nucleocapsid protein is one of the major protein actually. Spikes are very few. And so if the major protein become strong and much better way packed, that means they oligomerize much better and they recognize the RNA better, you get higher titer of virus. And that will happen naturally if it's a good mutation for virus purpose. If the good mutation, they become much higher in infection cycle, the replication cycle, they get higher protein, they transmit faster. And because it's the nature of the RNA, they will change time to time, but not all mutations are important. Whether it's in N or whether it's in M, wherever, or spike is not so important. There will drift here and there. That doesn't make too much difference, but certain one suddenly make a much better. Why they become not like that? Because more people get infected, high titer virus, they will transmit more and more will be there efficient. That's why only one take over the other, one pushes the other. Slower growth goes out, the other one comes. So that's the way the virus work. All viruses work exactly same way.
Yep. But how does the following on from that then? I mean, you talked about then, this idea of viral fitness. They've only got 15 genes, haven't they? It's remarkable what little bugger can do with just 15 genes. Anyway, and I think most of us can understand what leads to a new variant being dominant. But what I want to really ask you again about is more about the feeling for the future of the variants. Will there come a point at which they've more or less kind of played out? There's not much less for them. They can't keep ever mutating forever because they're not that big. They haven't got that many places they can mutate. So would you expect them now to basically fade away in the future as the months and years go by?
Yes, I expect so. All viruses do. They have to slowly then come down, and they don't have so much space to make mutation anymore almost. So this, of course, you cannot expect too many variant anymore, because it's just done their mutation wherever important area. Because mutation is happening, but they are not important. Only the important one we see the problem. And that's done probably more or less. And I don't see that we're going to see more emergence, different variant. No, I don't believe that will happen.
Okay. I mean, a few of your colleagues say that it's still possible that, suddenly something dramatic can happen and life will come to an end again. But more of your colleagues seem to think that that's less likely.
Less likely, because if something dramatic happened in receptor binding site, virus will not grow, no replication. Virus must go inside. If it's too many mutation, they will not going to go and replicate. So this is the reason. They have to be cautious, and we have to be cautious, human body. So I think, no, we are done more or less. New emergence. Yeah.
Last question directly for you would be also another one that's come in, and I need to get this right. But this is the idea that there's the new drug, the Merck drug. I can't remember how you pronounce it. I don't know. Anyway, the new Merck drug, whatever it is, however you pronounce it, which they're apparent, according to the question, that this kind of interferes with the virus's ability to replicate and litters its genome with mutations. But apparently, there's an argument that actually this could theoretically be dangerous, and that it could actually trigger the rise of new variants. Are you aware of this possibility or argument, and do you think it's a serious risk that we need to be concerned about, or just an unusual and rare side effect?
I don't know about this drug, but I don't think that will happen because, as I said, you can have that what we call evasion problem,
right?
Spike protein stuff. But the drug, I think that all the drugs are being used are trying to stop the receptor binding, mostly that S protein. But I think that not necessarily are going to get new variant. New variant means virus has to survive. If they cannot get in properly, if they cannot replicate properly, we're not going to get it. So virus will mutate some, but they are not going to be infectious more. Infectious more that we can see now, and this is the small area of nucleocapsid protein, so most of the mutation shown, the 7 residues only, different combination. And I don't think that is the possibility for, to have any impact on the new, making more viruses or new viruses emerging.
That's great. Thanks for that. So let's go a bit more general then, a question for all, but probably let's start with you, Calum. So I believe we are still allowed to talk about Europe without becoming an offence. So a huge amount going on in Europe at the moment, as we can see. Slovenia, Slovakia, Austria, Czech Republic, all going into lockdown. Hungary shortly to follow. The whole of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it seems, is now involved. What's the panel's views on what is going on there? And I accept the fact that it's never going to be one thing. But Calum, do you want to kind of start off from your perspective?
Happily kick off, and everything I say is with a massive pinch of salt.
Of course.
We really just don't know. But my suspicion is it's a combination that actually Britain, UK got it right by vaccinating early with AZ. And it probably does give you a good T memory cell response in the long term, which is protective against severe disease, if not acquisition of infection. We've also had relatively high levels of transmission throughout the summer, which will have probably taken the edge off a 4th wave. Essentially, we've just had a really big 3rd wave with high levels of transmission, but relatively less hospital admission. And therefore, it's harder to have a really big spike up when you're already halfway up the hill of the outbreak. So we've never really come down as far as transmission goes. If you want to use the anagram, essentially we have squashed the sombrero, but it's still high levels of transmission and high levels of ongoing moderate sickness in the community that are causing some degree of social disruption. So I think that's why we're different to Europe. And we're coming into winter now when the other usual seasonal viruses are definitely coming back. We're seeing more flu and RSV in our communities. So if I've got a crystal ball and tea leaves to hand, I suspect we're not going to have a huge 4th wave of COVID, but I think we are going to have a very, very difficult winter with high levels of absenteeism of staff and quite significant pressures on our healthcare service, and possibly pressures on our other emergency services and our next tiers down, the just-in-time delivery systems for food, fuel, and everything else that's dependent on just-in-time delivery systems, even your Amazon and your Turkey delivery.
Okay. I suddenly realized the sun has been following me around the room, so I've had to kind of change position a bit. But
you won't see the sun on Mersey side.
No. Stephen, accepting also a pinch of salt, what's your take, and what can we learn from what's happening at the moment in Mittel Europa, as my father used to call it?
Yeah, well, it's where my family comes from, so it doesn't feel that far from home. I suppose the first thing, and the WHO made this point today, that it shows that however important the vaccine is, and it certainly is important, and we certainly need to increase levels of vaccination. I would say booster, but I don't like the term booster. I think it's unhelpful. It implies it's something secondary rather than that it's integral to the vaccine program. We need more, and whatever we think about the more that they're doing in Europe, at least they are doing more, whereas in this country we seem to be sticking to the notion that that vaccination alone is the response. In terms of where we go, I mean, one of the issues, of course, is, and I would say this, is the behavioural dimension and what happened with behaviour after July the 19th, because one of the extraordinary things when you look at the at the surveys of behavior as it goes on, is it maps very closely onto what's happening in the pandemic. So if you look at people's levels of concern, if you look at their behaviors, if you look at their desires for there to be measures around COVID, it tracks what is actually happening in the pandemic far more closely than government policy does. So I don't know whether the government is following the science, but I think the public certainly are following the science. And one of the most interesting indications of that, I think, is if we go back to last year, and if we go back to the infamous Cummings affair, one of the things that happened very, very quickly was a plummeting in levels of trust in the UK government, not the Scottish government, not the Welsh government, but specifically the UK government. Some of the pollsters were saying they'd never seen as dramatic a fall. However, while trust fell in the UK government, levels of adherence did not fall. And while trust, say, between the Scottish government and the UK government was like night and day, if you look at levels of adherence to, say, mask wearing, social distancing, and so on, it was almost identical, because a lot of people were adhering despite the government. And I think one of the things that has happened throughout, and again, not only the self-report figures, but things like CCTV evidence of the number of people wearing masks in stations and so on, suggests very high levels of compliance. The areas where people are not complying, however, are less to do with the psychology than with either the information or the practicality. So, of course, for people to do the right thing, they need to know what the right thing is. And the evidence suggests that people still don't understand enough the importance of ventilation and the importance of a regular testing. And the second thing is, and in many ways, this is the simplest metric of all, the number of contacts we have on a daily basis. As people will know, before the pandemic, that stood at about 11 or 12. At the height of restrictions, it fell to about 3. It's now creeping up to 4 or 5. But despite the newspapers, which tell us that it is primarily a matter of people socializing too much, going to raves, going to parties, and so on, actually nearly all the increase in socialization has to do with increased mixing at work, where people don't have choice. So it seems to me that actually, and I go back to this point, that the public in many ways have been the strong point of this pandemic. The public on the whole have been following the science. The public have been trying to keep themselves safe. But what happens in the future, in many ways, is critically dependent upon that. And I do think, therefore, the issues of social mixing around Christmas, the issues of testing around Christmas are going to be absolutely critical to what sort of January we have, and whether we follow the pleasure of seeing our families at Christmas with mourning them in January, or whether we all keep ourselves safe into the new year.
You'll always get votes for praising the public, but I want to stick the knife into the public, actually. And there's a perfect opportunity to do so is the latest paper from James Rubin and his group, who you've probably seen it, which suggests that a lot of the work we do, you do, everyone, is based on surveys, and we ask people about their behavior, and we have other ways. And it looks as, and he and his team did a study of actually watching what people did in restaurants and shopping centers and supermarkets and railway stations and all this kind of stuff, and matching it with the records of what they said in surveys during exactly the same week. And it turns out people are pretty accurate. So about 60% or 70% said they always wore a mask, and that was roughly what we were seeing. But they were dreadfully wrong, or indeed lying, when it said 40% of them said, oh, I always observe social distancing, and 30% said, I always do hand washing. It was something like 5% and 6% or something like that actually were doing it when they were being observed. So maybe the public is lying to you, Stephen.
Well, I mean, first of all, I think sometimes we misinterpret the statistics. So let me take the statistics on mask wearing. And when you give the 85% figure, everybody always laughs at you. But the 85% figure is not of people always wearing masks. It's people wearing masks some of the time when they go out. So if they were to wear them, say, half the time, then it would mean that at any given time, 40% of the public would be wearing masks. Now, the point, as always with statistics, is how you interpret them, not whether they're right or wrong. So that figure doesn't tell you, the 80% figure doesn't tell you how many people at any one point will be wearing masks, but how many people are at least prepared to wear masks, or at least aren't anti-mask or haven't rejected masks. So I think that figure still is useful. The second thing is that on certain things, as you say, like mask wearing, it is corroborated by other forms of evidence. And of course, one always needs to triangulate evidence. So GPS evidence is important, and CCTV evidence is really important. The third thing is, often the issue is your ability to judge. So wearing a mask or not wearing a mask is fairly simple to know whether you're doing it. Social distancing, I mean, it's complicated because there are multiple people around in a space. Often it's difficult to tell how distant we are from others. So sometimes there is a distance between, if you like, the motivation to do something and having the information on which to do it. And therefore, giving very clear information, setting out 2-meter markers so people know what 2 meters is really important. Let me finish with something which is a bee in my bonnet at the moment, which I think is quite a nice example of the importance of providing clear information to people so they can keep safe. One of the mantras of the government is it's up to us. But the problem is it's very difficult for us to do certain things unless we have clear information and unless we have the support, like, for instance, staying at home and not mixing at work. So we can't fulfill our responsibilities unless the government fulfill their responsibilities as well. But in terms of information, as we know more and more, because this is an airborne virus, and because of the importance of the aerosol form, then ventilation in many ways is probably the most critical thing we should do. I mean, ventilation is probably more important than washing hands for the virus. Washing hands and keeping hands clean, of course, is important in general terms. But how do we know whether the spaces we're going into are safe or not? How can we make those judgments to keep ourselves safe unless we have systematic information? Now, the Northern Ireland Executive is beginning to consider what's called a scores on the doors system, much like hygiene certificates, to have a clear indication when you go into the space, has it got COVID protections in place? Is the ventilation adequate? What should you do? So I think rather than castigating the public as being irresponsible, it's far more productive to produce the context and the resources and the information which allow people to express their responsibilities. And I think there's a lot more that could be done in that regard. And I think if every space had a clear indication of COVID protection, it would give us choice. I think it would probably also increase footfall because people would be more willing to go to safe spaces, and it would have very positive public health consequences as well.
Okay, so I mean, you managed to take us from the Danube Basin straight back to behavioral science without blinking an eye. I just wondered if Calum or Polly had anything they wanted to contribute on that before we moved on to the next topic. Calum.
Jonathan Van Tam right at the start said the rules are for everyone. And I completely accept what Stephen's saying, that the public are far more sensible than we give them credit for. And indeed, young people are far more generous of their time and volunteering in the community than anyone ever imagined they would be. But I think we also should expect leadership by example. And it's disappointing when we don't see leadership by example, particularly in settings where there's close proximity to older people or in healthcare environments. I think we expect our colleagues and patients to wear masks in these settings and to adhere to the rules. And I think we should expect that of our medical and civic leadership in the same regard, because otherwise people say, what the hell? Good for the goose, good for the gander. Thank you.
I just want to challenge that ever so slightly to all of the panel here, because this is not really a science question, but it's still a question. You're obviously thinking there was a picture in the papers yesterday of Boris Johnson taken at the theatre, watching Macbeth of all things. You wouldn't think, I thought he'd cheering up at the moment. But anyway, he was watching Macbeth, and he had his mask off during the play, and he put it on at the end. And some member of the public caught it on their iPhone, and it was in all the press. And people then said what you've just said. But I don't know, one said, maybe Stephen, you're going to have to come back on this one, but do you think actually people do follow what the Prime Minister does? I mean, I'm sure you don't. That's talking to you, Stephen, but you as well, Calum. And
I'm glad to say I hadn't taken heed of the activities of our Prime Minister yesterday, and I was speaking in a general and hypothetical manner, which it would be unfair to target any individual who might have.
But I mean, it's a general thing. Maybe we are overestimating the impact that significant figures have. I don't know.
No, I don't think we are. I think it was incredibly valuable when Dana Spencer shook the hands of a patient in a bed who was cahexic. I recall that as being, because I was a medical student or a PhD student at Middlesex Hospital when that happened, and that shook the earth, that you could actually touch, inverted commas, these people, close inverted commas, as it was perceived at the time. Leadership by example, I personally think is very important, but I'm not the psychologist. I'm straying out of line here. Stephen, please bail me out, Stephen.
I don't want to bring Stephen back, but I've got to bring Stephen back on this one. Come on, and then we'll go to Polly.
I think you're forced to talk to me. It's terrible.
I know. It's terrible. Okay. Yeah, it is.
So the first law of social influence in many ways is we are more likely to be influenced by people we see as in group than out group, as of us and as for us. And as soon as a source begins to be seen as out group, they lose influence. Now, for me, let me go back to the Cummings affair. The point for me about the Cummings affair was not what he did as an individual. If you remember, the chief medical officer in Scotland broke the rules as an individual.
Yes, indeed.
The point was that the government very quickly said that's unacceptable. Everybody has got to behave properly. And the difference, and I think what made the Cummings affair was him being backed in that press conference on the Sunday by Boris Johnson, because that made it collective, and that began to lead the notion of one law for us and another for them, us and them, undermining influence. Now, in terms of the impact on behavior, it's complex, but there are influences. So on the one hand, as I said, quite a few people began to adhere to prove that they were not like Johnson and not like Cummings. So the work of Daisy Fancourt, for instance, and of others, showed that some of the people who were most angry at Cummings were most likely to adhere. But still, you don't want the government to lose influence and lose trust, because when they say other things to you, like the vaccine is safe, you might not trust them, and you might not go along with them. So I think it has corrosive consequences. The other consequence is, and this happened a lot around the Cummings affair, was it might not change people's minds, but it gives them a warrant to behave in particular ways if they want to. So they can say, well, why should I stay under lockdown? Cummings went to Barnard Castle, or why should I wear a mask? Boris Johnson doesn't. So it's not necessarily about changing attitudes, it's about warranting and legitimating certain forms of behavior. So I do think it has quite a few consequences, and I do think it's problematic. If I could say something finally, I don't think it's accidental either. Because, and this is moving away from COVID, there was a piece written by the Prime Minister in The Sun about climate change, and publicly what the Prime Minister was saying was we've got to do something about climate change. And this piece says, I will not let the eco-fascists smash into your houses in their sandals and force you to change their boiler. Johnson's politics very much rest upon setting up an enemy and then saying to people, I'm going to protect you against them. And I think that's going on in COVID as well. I think it's deliberate signaling, saying there are the people who want to impose on you. I will defend your freedom. So all the talk about Freedom Day and so on was setting up this enemy who wants to take your freedom away, who he's going to protect you against. So I think it is not a mistake I think it's a political strategy, and it might be quite a powerful political strategy. It's not very good for public health.
Okay, I know we'll get people now saying we've gone too far into politics. Perhaps we have, who knows? I also know we're going to get people saying that I'm not picking up questions that have been put here. But I would remind everyone, this is a catch-up program, so I am using questions that have been left over as well. And I'm not going to ask you to respond to this one, but I am just going to say one point, which is that if this issue of trust is so important and behaviour is so important and so on, but actually between England and Scotland, there are big variations in trust in leaders, big variations. We all know that. That's just a simple point of fact. And yet, behaviours, infection rates, etc., are pretty damn similar between the two jurisdictions. So I'm still, that's my prerogative, Chairman, just to leave it like that and say, I wonder if people actually don't pay as much attention as we might think they do. Now then, I want to change the subject as well, and unless Polly, is this on? I know obviously you're the virologist here, but you also a citizen here as well, of course. Anything you wanted to bring in at this point?
Well, I think that it's important that we keep the, in the crowd, we must have the mask wearing, is important, because as Simon said, Stephen said, that is a respiratory disease, but we mustn't be so scared also all the time that we're going to catch virus. It's not that easy to catch virus, really. You have to have a load of virus before you can catch it from somebody. So if you, every single time you have to wash your finger, which I don't think is important. It doesn't come from the skin really, unless you have really sneezed in your fingers, a lot of virus, and then you're handshaking. That's a different thing. So I think we mustn't be too worried about those things so much, but in the crowd or in the subways, in undergrounds or buses, it's a good idea to have the mask. But because just to prohibit, most of the people already have vaccines. We are not going to really spread so much the people who are vaccinated. Is the unvaccinated people are the one that no symptoms, they're the more risky one. So I don't have to, it is a good idea to have a mask because it's precaution, but doesn't mean that we have to really think about every second you see somebody outside there, they're already, oh, I have a mask, somebody's there. That's happening in my university also, which I think is strange in a way. Virus don't jump like that, really. You have to be a certain distance and have to be a load of virus. Also, even if 100 particles of virus, only 1 or 2 will go to you. It's not that easy. It's not that easy. The receptor is not ready to take you all the time. So I think we have to be a little bit more moderate about everything, although we have to have masks. We have to keep not the crowded people, it shouldn't go to the crowded places so much, particularly vulnerable people. But if you're vaccinated and they have 3 doses already, I don't see why you have to be so scared of, because you do have good antibody. I have good antibody, I know. So I know that that is the rules. That's why we take vaccine. So we don't have to be everybody so scared, but it is some good policy to have the mask in the public place. That's fine. We have to probably stay like that for a little while more.
Okay, well said. All right, now we normally would finish that now, but we have had a dispensation. We usually allow the panel shows to run on a little bit more because we have so many excellent speakers. We want to use their wisdom. So I thought we'd end with back to the subject. Well, no, back to start with. Again, I'm seeing live questions as well coming in on vaccination again, and several different questions, but really all of them about in different ways about how to increase vaccine levels. So I'll start off by pointing out that ignoring the booster vaccines, but it seems pretty clear that the level of people who have had no vaccine at all is now pretty static. It's going up by maybe 10,000 a day, which is nothing in population terms. And we're not really making any further impact in that area. I think that's what the figures have been telling us now for some months. So if we could just end with each of you, and I'll actually start with you, Polly, actually, because someone has also said, what can we do about the social media memes still going around that vaccines affect the immune system? Well, obviously they do, that's their point, but it means in a bad way. That's one of the things going around, and there's a lot of fake news around. Someone else has asked about the is it true that Italy downgraded its figures from, was it 130,000 deaths to 3,000 deaths? Well, I can answer that. No, it's not true. It's a lie. So there's a lot of fake and lies going around. But Polly, do you want, I'm going to ask each of you in turn to say, first of all, do you think there is more we can do, or we just have to settle for the fact we're going to be stuck on 80, 82%, whatever it is, and does that matter? And you, Polly, just explain, just in case there is someone listening in the media who would like to just repeat what you're about to say, but about why vaccines do not damage the immune system.
The vaccines that made everything about the vaccine made is one portion of the virus, which is spike protein, and also for RNA vaccine, they're doing this just RBD, which is the receptor binding portion. And now Cuban people have made also that protein-based vaccines. All these vaccines are extremely safe, extremely safe. When somebody said, I was sick because of the vaccine, something else they have already, and they're probably sensitive. I'm sensitive to influenza virus vaccine generally. That doesn't mean that it is the cause of the virus. It's a vaccine itself. It's the me. I'm probably sensitive about something there. But vaccine is essential right now for everyone possible. And that is the best way. And I think that we have now, many of us have vaccine already. So really, we don't have to be so worried about that anymore, I think, definitely. But I'm asking everybody possible, take the booster dose as soon as possible, because you sustain your antibody longer. Whatever you have is longer. People who are already infected, they have a high antibody already. They're all right. So we have many infected people before, older people, so they're all right still. So I don't think as a virus, if I'm a virus, I won't be able to get into you because you already have antibody. I know. Even if I got so little amount, you're not going to get sick. So majority of us have vaccine, and then I think rest of them should try to take the vaccine possible. That's the best way to go forward.
Okay, Calum, I'm going to ask you to finish with something on children and vaccines, but Stephen, basically, first of all, and this is Carol Allen's just asked, but is there anything left that we can still do in population terms to increase the never vaccinated group? Or do we just have to accept that that's as far as we can get? And I'm leaving out the issue of compulsion, which is a very separate argument. So that I noticed Germany looks like it's about to go to compulsory vaccination. I suspect that will get struck out by the Constitutional Court, but I don't think there's any chance we are going to do that on a population level. So Stephen, what would you think is there something left that we should be doing?
Well, I think there is. I mean, I'm against compulsion, and I won't talk about compulsion in detail, but let me explain, and it goes back to what I was saying right at the beginning, that there are two ways of looking at the issue. One is to look at it in terms of the individual and individual cognition and say, well, there are certain people who are either they're selfish or they're stupid or they don't understand the information. And another way of looking at it is in terms of, collectivities and social relationships. And fundamentally, it seems to me, this is an issue of trust, and it's why trust is so important, because most people, they're not virologists, they're not epidemiologists, they know they don't have the expertise, so they've got to listen to sources telling them things. So the question is, what is their relationship to those sources of information, and do they trust them or not? And much of what's going on is a sense of distrust, which is why low levels of vaccination are much greater in populations who historically have a troubled relationship with authority. It's much higher in more deprived groups, it's much higher in unemployed groups, it's much higher in ethnic and religious minorities. So it is fundamentally a question of trust. So the issue is, how do you build that trust? And you don't build it by calling people stupid or calling them selfish or having a go at them. You start off by respecting them and respecting their concerns. You go on by listening to them. You go to them, you work through their communities. And where those types of measures are used, they are very effective. The WHO, right at the beginning of the pandemic, said the key thing is community engagement, and we're beginning to forget that with other measures. So I would argue...
Although they are changing their minds, Stephen. The WHO of Europe seemed to be changing his mind.
Well, they're
in the
allowing a
last few
debate
days.
on it, but they still stress the importance of engagement and the importance of discussion. So I would argue the things that we should be doing should be, number one, increasingly make sure that we go to people rather than wait for them to come to us, make it easier to engage and listen, have experts, allow people to go away and make their minds up, but also think about the practicalities, making sure that we, pay so that people can get paid time off to go and get vaccinated. If they are poorly for a day or two, and a few people are poorly for a day or two, make sure that's affordable as well. I think practical, simple public health measures are proven, and we should be doing more of those, and they bring rewards.
I have to just mute myself. Okay, that's a beautiful answer, and I do actually agree with you. Although one should just point out a degree of coercion seems to have been quite effective in France for reasons that
can I answer that?
But anyway.
Can I answer
All right,
that quickly?
It's my fault for asking.
What you find with coercion, and you're finding it in Austria as well, is that for the vaccine indifferent who are not vaccinated because they haven't got around to it, exerting a cost means that they queue up, and you're seeing people queuing up to get vaccinated in Austria. On the other hand, for people who have low trust, it increases their opposition. It gives increased traction to the far-right groups, and it leads to people queuing up to demonstrate in the streets. I think there are better ways of achieving the positive without having the negative.
Yeah, good point. And there is a strong far right in Austria, as we both know. Okay, Calum.
So, I agree hugely. And we really need grassroots involvement to advocate that vaccines are better than the virus. I think we have fallen into a trap by saying that vaccines are incredibly safe without putting into context that with every vaccine, you do expect to have a shivery night, and that's part of the vaccine working, and helping people to understand that is not mini COVID, and it's not giving you COVID. That's the vaccine working, and that's your immune system waking up and recognizing it and doing its job. Explaining the incredibly rare side effects, we need to again put it into context that occasionally you do get very rare side effects, but on the whole and on the population basis, that's better again than the virus. A really good example is the viral myocarditis, where we have seen a number of young, on the whole, young, otherwise healthy men having inflammation of the heart, some of them having chest pain, some of them having raised biomarkers, but all of them making a good recovery to the vaccine. And people then being hesitant about promoting the vaccine in this group. Now that we've got higher transmission amongst children and young people, we have now seen deaths in the children and young people from myocarditis caused by the virus. Now, these are incredibly rare events, but they happen. But yet again, we're seeing evidence that the virus is more dangerous than the vaccine. And it's how we transmit that information in a calm and careful way. I agree that what you don't want is a pale male in an ivory tower, such as me doing this. You really want the wives and girlfriends of the footballers, I think, doing this. And sometimes if you can find the family affected by a tragedy, they can make a very good case in their community as well. So I think we need to be smarter about how we do this. I think there's got to be a broader debate as well about the benefits to public health through vaccination. And I think we haven't worked out how to do this, particularly when we're talking about children and the younger teenagers, where in reality, the danger of the virus to them is small. And I'm going to be castigated for saying that, because people are going to say, what about long COVID? And I will back to them and say, well, I lead a research study that looks at long COVID in children, and we have measured it. It is real. I'm not a long COVID denier, but the reality is it is relatively rare and relatively less severe than children admitted to hospital with meningitis or community-acquired pneumonia. They have long-term sequelae as well. We don't call that long meningitis. We just say they've had damage caused by meningitis. But that's why we vaccinate people against meningitis and vaccinate them against pneumococcal pneumonia. And it gives us a herd benefit. It benefits the whole class, because not only do you protect the individual, you protect their classmates. And somehow in the debate around COVID, we've lost the discussion about protecting the classmates. And I think that is the fault of us as scientists and advisors. We haven't taken the public health benefit message of vaccinating a community to protect the community. And there is an altruistic and positive benefit to doing that. So yeah, there's lots of lessons to be learned. I would definitely give us a could do better mark on the vaccination and communication aspects.
Beautiful answer, thanks. Now, can I just ask the panel just to stay there and people to stay there? I have a couple of housekeeping things just to say, to remind you that this series continues, as it always does. We also have our In Conversation series. Next Wednesday is Jane Dacre in the evening, the president of the Royal College, ex-president of the Royal College of Physicians. And then I'm going to be talking to Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Greater Manchester, on the 8th, also in the evening. In real life at the RSM, it's amazing. I can actually now talk about real life again, but again, fantastic things coming up. Richard Horton will be doing the Salisbury lecture on the 29th. And if you remember his In Conversation, you will know that he has very, very strong views on these subjects. And Stephen O'Reilly will be doing the Howard lecture on 100 years of insulin on the 2nd of December. And then returning on the 3rd, Jed Mercurio, who I spoke to before the pandemic. He's now coming back to talk to a professional, Victoria MacDonald. I have no idea what about actually, but I do now know Jed, and he's the most brilliant person to interview and completely terrifying, but I'm sure that Victoria will keep him in check. And finally, the next COVID episode is on Thursday, the 9th of December. We'll be looking at the impact on the pandemic on mental health, which we haven't actually done for some time, but focusing very much on the NHS staff. Okay, now then, back to our panel. Last week, I'm told that the Now Show had a wonderful monologue on how some scientists seem to be able to talk nonsense about absolutely everything and everyone during the pandemic, going so far off piece as to end up in an icy Swiss river. Well, I think you'll all agree this panel has been absolutely brilliant, staying on piece, but informed, intelligent, and occasionally even humorous about things, but and a wonderful combination of 3 different disciplines interworking together. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. I'm sure you will as well in your feedback. And if at the same time as giving wonderful feedback, you also give a donation to the RSM, then our chief executive will thank me over Christmas. Okay, we finished, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much. Thanks to the panel, thanks to the audience, and the show goes on. The show goes on, so stay tuned to these webinars as we approach our 100th next year. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks, Calum. Thanks, Polly. And thanks, Stephen.
Thank you.
A great pleasure.